Lula da Silva in Brazil, Néstor Kirchner in Argentina, Tabaré Vázquez in Uruguay, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Michelle Bachelet in Chile, and probably this year, Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico. Latin America, mostly South America, is trying to make possible this other world. It's been now 2 years, first in 2005 in Porto Alegre and this year in Caracas, Venezuela. I headed the delegation of the Armenian National Committee of South America to the World Social Forum. We tried to find a place for the Armenians and Armenia in this global process at the right historical momentum, link the engagement with our identity to the wider engagement of that part of humanity that is struggling for justice and the very future of not only their children, but of mankind and the planet. Now, I really don't know what the future of our engagement with the World Social Forum will be, and I less know what the Social Forum will be in the future. But since the day I read about this global mobilization, the signals of which were already sent by the Zapatista rebellion in Chiapas, Mexico in 1994, and the quote, 5 days that shook the world in November 1999 in Seattle, Washington, I thought that the Armenians and less the ARF could possibly stay out of this process, avoid getting involved of yet another quote-unquote dream. Therefore, when I received this invitation from the Armenian East Coast CC to speak at this conference about the Armenian identity, I thought that the best topic of my presentation will be Manifesto for another diaspora. Now, I sustain that another diaspora is needed for the Armenians in the 21st century because it at least facilitates and surely could lead another ethics of engagement of the nation to the process of globalization. And only the progressive forces of the nation have the progressive forces of the nation present both in Armenia and in diaspora can define and implement this ethics of engagement, a new program, a new agenda for diaspora and hopefully for Armenia. I furthermore sustain that another diaspora is possible because a process of transformation is already taking place in the diaspora, and that process of transformation is leading, for the best or the worst, to the transnationalization of the Armenian identity. It is, as far as we can see, a fragmented process, if not a process of fragmentation within the diaspora. Not that the diaspora was in the past united and one, and now it is losing its unity. No. The internal strife, sometimes bloody, of the 70 years of the diaspora existence was not the exception, but the rule. Nevertheless, both for the left and the right persisted a major narrative of the why and for what of diaspora. For nearly 70 years, it gave meaning to both who fought for the Soviet regime and against the Soviet regime. For those who supported the Soviet regime, for those who denied its legitimacy. To those who supported Echmiadzin and the others who did so for Anterias. For those who were for and got engaged with the struggle of Haitat and those who opposed it. For those who linked the Armenian cause with the struggle against imperialism, and those who wanted to see the Armenian case as unique. It is this master narrative of the diaspora that has entered into a deep crisis, if not simply vanished, since 1991, a turning point in our history, and the emergence of a free and independent Armenia. And we need to get involved in the intellectual and the real-world social construction of another diaspora. Now, let me at this point explain and clarify some ideas that I have been using in this conceptual abstraction, in their conceptual abstraction, or as assumption that some normative arguments more than empirical assessment. First, by narrative, I do not mean fiction. I mean social construction. A social construction is both the idea and the structure of a process. It is the basis upon which emancipation and engagement can be rationally, not randomly, be understood and explained. So when I talk about a master narrative of diaspora, I simply mean the conditions of the institutions, the conditions and the institutions of the historical context in which the then leading actors define the ethics of engagement. The master narrative of diaspora then was very functional, but as any process, it was historically bounded. It was historically bounded by certain conditions that are no more. These conditions have vanished, therefore the master narrative of diaspora stopped to be functional. Second, by focusing on the diaspora, I by no means preach two or more nations. In fact, if I hold on the term diaspora and see a danger in the concept of transnationalization of the Armenian identity, I don't want to live outside the idea of homeland linked to the national identity. I still think that we are not in the so-called postmodern condition of existence where we can just think about any identity as an abstract, non-material construction, but we are very much in what we can call the late modernity or hyper-modernity, where still this linkage between ideas and material conditions exists, although albeit in a different form. So I sustain that there still is a relationship between the why and for what of diaspora and the homeland. But if we stick on the old traditional understanding of this linkage between the national identity and the homeland, I think that it will be threatening for the future of diaspora and the future of Armenia. At the best, that traditional and understanding, that master narrative of diaspora, could lead to a stagnated situation in terms of engagement, and at worst, it provokes disenchantment with and denial of the Armenian identity in diaspora. We need something different from the so far one nation, one land, one culture slogan. Not to deny this slogan, not to deny the truth of this slogan, but to rationally find how to make it real, to make real in the context of the unity, diversity. There are two more reasons why I focus on diaspora as the leader and facilitator of the engagement with the World Social Forum process. The first, whereas in Armenia, identity is discussed, widely written about, is debated, nonetheless, it's a natural phenomenon. It is not an existential crisis, an existential dilemma. Identity is inherent in the concept of diaspora, and the diaspora exists because we thought about identity. For the last 20 years, I had the opportunity to visit a fairly good number of Armenian communities all over the world and discover communities as distant as in Johannesburg, South Africa, and Caracas, Venezuela. I mean distant not in geographical terms, because this is very relative, but distant in the sense that they usually do not appear on our radar screen as communities. And I can assure you that I see in every community a crisis that we in South Africa, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and somehow Chile, the periphery of the diaspora, are living day by day. The most visible part of this crisis is the financial bankruptcy of our institutions. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. The crisis is morally and existentially deeper. Economically prosperous communities might not see it, yet was not Argentina on the top of the donors in the past to both diaspora communities and Armenia, and it stopped being it for the last 10 years? And of the 7 schools that we have in Argentina, none has avoided the financial and other sort of crisis today. Now, the second reason, and please, this is not a doomsday philosophy, and I'm not pretending to be a Cassandra. I'm just a social scientist trying to see the facts. And by no means these processes are inevitable or destiny. It is because we can change the reality of the engagement that we are talking about, the dangers of not thinking about these processes. The second reason is that Armenia is already part of the process of globalization, even though we fail to understand how this process began at the first place. The transition from the Soviet regime meant the inclusion of Armenia in the expansive process of free market and all its consequences, privatization, economic liberalization, and so forth. We can discuss if the economy of Armenia is doing well, if the poverty is falling, if the economy is getting better, but I think that what we cannot avoid is to see that Armenia is part of a globalization that does not have the ethics of the World Social Order. Thank you. I don't know if someday the importance of this ethics in Armenia will be understood. I hope so. But so far, because of its global connections, because of its global presence, diaspora can, I repeat, need to lead this process. So let me give my argument why I think that the meta-narrative of diaspora should be changed today, and if I have some time, just to mention 5 points how an agenda for another diaspora could be thought of. My argument goes like this. The sociology of the Armenian diaspora is still a missing research program, except for occasional and almost personal initiatives. Nevertheless, it is not incorrect to resume the great narrative of the diaspora in the following theoretical terms. The diaspora is the consequence of the genocide. According to the law of the nations, this forced dispersion of the Armenians outside the homeland is an unnatural phenomenon. Hence, the diaspora could only be temporary and would inevitably perish if the nation someday does not return to its natural habitat, the historical homeland. A corollary of this theory might be the engagement for an Armenian diaspora, for an Armenian in diaspora, could only aim at preserving the national identity against the threat of assimilation, metaphorically often described as white massacre, Wehrmachtschlag, until the day of redemption, the return to the promised land. The consequence of this master narrative has been closed structures, a conservative understanding of our identity, and an agenda focused on the concept of Haya Bafanu. In Armenian, there is no difference between preservation and conservative or conservation. Yes. So it's basically the same concept. It's a conservative understanding. It's not the development of the Armenian identity. It's the preservation of the Armenian identity. The first crisis of this identity were the 70s and the 80s with the so-called engagement for the high top and the armed struggle in those years. Yet this crisis did not modify the master narrative of diaspora. Still, we had very present this connection between diaspora and Islam. Nonetheless, in 1991, unfortunately, as the turning point of a great diaspora narrative, is the fact that there never was any plan of massive return of diaspora Armenians to the free and independent homeland. Instead of attracting Armenians, the free homeland, for very understandable reasons, quote-unquote, expelled roughly 1/4 of its population, some 1 million persons. The majority of who came out of Armenia to look for their American dream, preferably in the United States, if not just anywhere, and did not have any intention of returning, nor could they become part of diaspora, the traditional diaspora.
Wrap it up, Kachi.
Okay. The new government of Armenia did not want to have on its agenda the issue of the repatriation of the diaspora. Neither was this an issue or concern of the civil society, of the emerging civil society in Armenia. And as for those diaspora Armenians who settled in Armenia, the decision was strictly personal and not part of a massive mobilization project. So we can discuss all these points. And rapidly, I think that there are 5 basic issues in the new agenda of the diaspora, in the program that could be called a manifesto for another diaspora. And these 5 points are the following. The cultural heritage of Western Armenia. Second, the multicultural nature of diaspora and the importance of diversity for the national development. Third, a strategic assessment of globalization to define the collective participation onto the process. The integration of the newly created social spaces in diaspora outside of the traditional structures of community. And fifth, the redefinition of the national interest from a diaspora perspective. I think that by implementing these 5 points for another diaspora, the integration of diaspora with the homeland and the integration of the different communities in diaspora will be possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Kachi, and thank you for heeding my reminders. I've been told that this is blocking some people's views, so I'm going to take a moment and move this podium like this, like a good moderator. Ah, yes. That's right, because our next presentation is going to have audio visuals. Our next presentation is by Neri Melkonian. Many of you know Neri. She's New York-based. She's an independent critic and curator who has held a number of institutional posts. She served as Associate Director of the Center for Curatorial Studies Museum at Bard College and as Director of Visual Arts Programming at the Center for Contemporary Arts in Santa Fe. She's talked on topics related to aesthetics of displacement, globalization, and transcultural geographies. Her topic today is entitled Exile as Home, the predisposition of Armenian artists since Gorky, 1915. Take it away, Neri.
Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here. When Sevak just first sent me the announcement of this event, I said it's about high time. You can take that either way, either a little late or Armenian time.
Can you use the microphone?
Thank you, Mr. Gasson. That was quite nice, and it kind of gives a nice background to what I'm about to say. I don't have formatting for various reasons. I'm going to make a few points and then share with you some slides. Usually what the artists say is more important than what I can offer you today under these time constraints. Okay, I thought I'm going to focus on political orientation of artists, starting with Gorky. So it's an odd predicament for me to be in, because usually when we talk about art, we kind of leave out biography, and now I'm going to have to sort of bring in only biography and leave out discussing the works. But I hope it makes sense, and I hope the artists, dead or alive, forgive me for that. Starting with Gorky. Gorky, as you know, had a major fallout with his best friend, Stuart Davis. This happened in the 30s, and it was over politics. They were buddies for many years. They went to rallies together. Davis was a communist. Gorky refused to become a member, even though he went to many of the rallies and meetings. And usually he's described as a provocateur. He went to those meetings to even disrupt those meetings. And ultimately what broke the relationship is because he said art comes first. And for Stuart, political engagement and activism was very important. Now, depending on how you look at the era back then, was Gorky progressive or was he reactionary politically? I'd say he was progressive, especially the way things folded a few years down the line. Now, I say he was progressive because aesthetically he was pursuing very progressive thoughts, things that no one else was really doing. At the same time, very few people know that Gorky was also a Stalinist. He did not publicly, share that. But that too, we need to look back in context. In other words, his Stalinism was more coming from, that enthusiasm we had initially, thinking, studying for Armenia, that little period when Stalin adapted, wanted, promised, So the news of the purges and the atrocities that was coming, it was very hard for Gorky to accept as true. So some people apologize for that, and they say, he looked at Stalin as a father figure, and given the experience he came from, the genocide, the death of his mother, that he couldn't have been anything else. All right, so I took a long time to sort of situate Gorky politically for you. I'm not going to show his work, except one image. But more or less, the model of Gorky, what Gorky represented, stays with us throughout the 20th century, with few examples. In other words, forget the Stalinist part, okay? Progressive, aesthetically, they do not get support from their own community if you are progressive. Politically, you don't fit exactly in the American or the mainstream, international, because they don't know how to translate you. Yes? So, there are moments that some Armenian artists have allied themselves with broader causes, be it the Palestinian let's say, or Native American, and we'll see some examples of those. When they do that, they're usually chastised by their own community, wherever that may be, Lebanon, Iran, US, marginalized within their own community, and with some experiences, we see that they actually get disillusioned at the end with the political side that they've chosen, as in the case of, let's say, Seta Manikian and her involvement with the left and the Palestinian cause in Lebanon. We will see that. So, in general, we can say that Armenian artists have always been cautious, skeptical, suspicious of political orientations. That does not mean they are themselves apolitical. They're usually on the forefront. And I'm talking about now progressive Armenian artists. I'm going to leave out a lot of artists who do not do this. And most of us are used to seeing those artists' works and accepting them as Armenian artists because they give us what we like to see, palatable, nice pictures, decorative, pretty Ararat, Kachkas, and most of the artists you're going to see today you probably have not heard of, you probably have not seen their work, and that's why I'm just going to run through the slides for you. Yeah, I know. Am I talking too much?
Not yet.
Not yet. So, the question keep in mind is what standards do we use? How do we situate these artists? Do we pick international standards or do we pick community standards? And of course, as Mr. Bukasian said, the community itself is complicated enough, is fragmented enough, is diverse and multicultural enough, so it just adds to the complexity of the topic at hand. And I must say, just because it's appropriate, that this is the first time I'm talking on this topic in 10 years. So that in itself should tell you where Armenian art as a topic, let alone Armenian artists, stand in the larger picture of things. So exile as home is, I think, the proper one for all purposes. Okay. Enough. Sarah, where did they go? Okay. So I clicked. I'm new at this, by the way. I lost all my images recently, so I had to regather and restructure. Yeah, well, like this can't be choosers. I adapt. Definitely, maybe third, fourth.
Did it ever go into speak on or something?
Turn it off. I
I think that's the best. Let me take your computer.
Okay, you take care of the computer. I'll talk more. Okay. Gorky, back to Gorky. It took a long time for Armenians to recognize Gorky, to adopt Gorky. Actually, Armenians did not adopt Gorky until recently, to be honest with you, because his market started bringing some very, very good prices, and Armenian collectors started buying him. Gorky, when he was starving, giving away his work for a cup of coffee, or nobody wanted it. They took it and threw it away. And I have names of people in New Jersey who were offered Gorky's work. Gorky himself offered it. It didn't work. That predicament continues. Maybe not to that exaggeration with many artists today, contemporary Armenian artists today, progressive contemporary Armenian artists today.
Yes.
Okay. So support. Support is essential. And you know, and I know, that the contemporary art world is a game, just like any other game. Just like you lobby for political causes in Washington, D.C., you have to lobby for whose aesthetics you want to push through the art world. It's as simple as that. I hate to be skeptical about it, so many of the artists you see is not because they're, fantastic or so unique or what, I mean, have you ever asked yourself why not another Armenian artist since Gorky, in the international scene? It's not because we lack the talents, it's because the displaced, the disorientation, the place, the lack of place, for them. Very quickly, the type of art Armenians collect, let's say since the 60s, 70s, probably that's when some modern Armenian collections began. The taste, the aesthetics of it, I believe, was dictated from Soviet Armenia. Whatever Soviet Armenia, it went through their lens. Whatever they endorsed, diaspora started collecting. Okay? Of course, first they pushed their own, Saryan, Avedisian, blah, blah, blah. And then they started looking outward because, of course, they needed to, include, and they did. They did include some diaspora artists, like Asadur is in the National Gallery, for instance. Setem Amedyan is not, Hagop Papazian is not, So keep that in mind. And that orientation to this day dictates, more or less. Even in post-Soviet times, okay? Armenians go all the way to Armenia, they bring suitcases full of art, like bazarda, like vegetable, They bring it home and they hang it on their walls. No, like, where do we fit in? Where does it fit in? Somehow it's perceived more authentic. That needs to shift, especially now. I'm not telling you to exclude. Armenia has some fabulous artists. I'm not saying exclude them, but usually those fabulous artists are not sitting in those collections. Do you see what I mean? So there's something very odd. Why? I'm not here to criticize. I'm not here to lament what we don't have. I think there is a way, and the way is create a space, create a place. These artists are carving a place out with their own work, but institutionally, they have no place. Look at America. We're sitting in, like the biggest cultural capital of the world, New York. We don't have one single space to show artwork, unless we want to go to a church hall. Okay? We don't even have a cultural center. Okay? Think about that. Same with LA, with a huge community like that. So, yet Armenia has it. And the relations with Armenia, they're improving. There are some, developments worthy to mention, and hopefully we'll have some chance to talk about that. But I don't see a cultural policy in Armenia, enforceable or being enforced, or information. So it's up to few individuals who are doing things, some are very worthwhile, but I'm not seeing the traffic being both ways.
This is the presentation you wanted, this is Armenian left A.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you, great. So quickly, I just threw this in. It's Gorky sitting with his contemporaries like Marcel Duchamp, various others, just to show you the difference between Gorky in his predicament, being part of the cosmopolitan progressive of his days. Okay? Oops. Alright. We'll come to it later. There's another group of artists from LA, usually most of them immigrants from Armenia. They're grouped together. So it makes a nice contrast to see the international versus, let's say, the community. The insular versus the open. Okay? So I'm not very sure if globalization is always bad, because there's also the danger of being too ethnocentric. We know about Gorky, but we don't know about Haig. Raoul Haig was a contemporary of Gorky. He was a friend of Gorky. He came from Istanbul. He must have heard and seen or read about the genocide, but no one talks about Haig. Haig ended up living in Woodstock. This was his wood cabin. He died about 10 years ago. He was a sculptor. He changed his name like Haig. He was one of the first and probably best expressionist sculptors, under-recognized, but he did leave his estate to a foundation, the Rothschild Foundation, through his dealer. So you will be hearing about him more. This was how he lived, very simple, like a hermit, very different than Gorky in sensibility. This is how the sculpture in progress. This is in his later years with one of his finished pieces. I doubt that they had a single Armenian collector, to be honest with you. I've heard stories of one or two of them bargaining for a piece. Then the Cold War era. We're sticking with America, and even though, let's say, they had to follow, artists had to follow, high modernism was mainly about abstraction, as you probably know. This is Garo Antresian. Even though he's working in high abstract forms, the piece is called Trapezoid. So there is usually a hidden link to their national identity. To be part of the mainstream, sometimes that has to be suppressed, as we learned from Gorky, and which is alright. You have to negotiate ways to see. This is Charles Garbitian, like Antresian. He's in his 80s. He still has not been embraced by the community. He's in major collections, and look at his work. Even though it has nothing to do with specifically Armenian topic, but the guy is very knowledgeable of what displacement and loss is. In fact, he himself, one day at a talk at Lucknow, said he himself did not know. He was unconscious of how Armenian identity had sort of gone into his subconscious. And he showed this slide, and that is one of his works. And then he showed this, and he said, look at the similarities. So, translation of what is Armenian may not fit this, but it is still Armenian. So it's about translation. Kardashonik, some of you have heard of him. He lives in upstate New York. Raoul Haig taught him how to sculpt. So he built this mehian on his property, and he used it as his exhibition space, out in the middle of nowhere, so that he's not dependent on commercial or market systems to exhibit his work. And this is his translation of, let's say, Armenian architecture, the acoustics and everything is perfect. I recommend all of you, maybe we should organize a tour, so because he's a neighbor of Gorky, we should go to Gorky and Kardash one day. Woodstock. This is upstate New York. Woodstock? Haig is in Woodstock, Kardash is in Stanford. That's Kardash in the 70s, in front of the Armenian diocese, holding on April 24, holding a plaque saying, "Unhate a Turk this day." They almost killed him, but he did it. And they probably killed him in different ways. Okay? This is another exhibition he had in Glendale. He put up a tent, again, based on his own architectural interpretations of Armenian architecture, and he exhibited in there. This is the top of the structure. He called the exhibit Portraits of the Dead, alluding to the community in LA. This was in the 80s. He thought the community in LA were stagnating. I'm being so rough, but I hope. Alright, this is another tent he put at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And this piece was called Borders Crossing. I won't get into it, it was brought down by the head. We're running out of time.
Instead of questions, let her go.
Marcos Grigorian from Iran. He was the first to start the Iranian International Art Biennial in the 50s. 1958. The guy works with earth art. He didn't have a place to work. He had given up his work. I invited him to my backyard. I was giving him sandpaper, brought him some assistance. He picked up Adobe and started working and producing with it. So I gave him an exhibit in my own backyard. These are his works. all dealing with earth. What is earth? Home. What is earth? Again, no place. Ardash, from Mosul, Iraq. He was a communist. Okay? No Armenian recognized him. Hago Papazian, he was a communist. He was expelled from Beirut, from Hamur. Okay? He was exiled. He ran out to Paris because of his Brechtian views. Can you imagine? He was a theater guy. Zadik Zadikyan, when he first came, Zadik escaped Armenia. He swam the channel to Turkey. Okay, this is happening in the late 60s. So he came to New York. He was right there with the progressive movements in New York, with minimalist art, site-specific art. This is a stairway he gilded in gold. This is a piece he did for Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, bricks. But he gained no recognition, so he switched. He kept his gold interpretations, but took it to a national icon. Okay, he chose. There he got more recognition. So I'm just letting you know how it works. This is that group of immigrant Soviet artists in LA. Compare this mentally with your with the first image we saw of Gorky with his contemporaries, the international group. These are all Soviet immigrants. Sonia Balasanian from Iran, speaking of surveillance, the veiling of women. Who has the power, the one behind the veil or the one looking at the veiled one? Ani Kupelian, a piece, a war monument for Lebanon. Sorry, I can't discuss it. Finally, Seta Manukyan. Seta Manukyan, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about her because I love her deeply. She is one of the few, if not the only, painter who depicted the turmoil of the Lebanese civil war. Not even Arab artists, not even her contemporaries. You might recall headlines in those days when the civil war was happening. Lebanese or most artists in Lebanon were painting still lifes, flowers. They were escaping from the turmoil and the difficulties. She went right head on. She also worked with the Palestinians in the south. So the fragility of the environment of Lebanon, and it doesn't have to be so literal, you can read it if you spend some time. This is Beirut for her, right before she left. She finally left because one day she went to her studio and saw a nude statue covered by a piece of cloth. Raincoat. So she realized it's time to get out, So she came to LA. One of the pieces, she continued to paint, and I'm not going to get into her paintings, what they looked like then, but she did a performance out of a dream that she had. She saw a horse in a gallery. She saw her bed in a parking lot. She saw her father on a tree. So she made a performance of, it tells you about displacement. Finally, her last phase, she went into meditation to cope with all the perhaps different phases of her life. She was politicized in Italy, in art school. So when she returned to Lebanon from Italy, she found Lebanon in turmoil and she couldn't have partake. But it all got to be too much. This is the last 5-6 years. Seka became a Buddhist. Okay? She went into meditation and she started working. Her work became a result of her meditation. And 6 months ago, she went to Sri Lanka and joined a monastery. She is a priest now. And she doesn't paint. She says, Mary, I don't need to paint. If I want, I'll paint. And I think that's the biggest political statement set up for an artist can make. I'm going to stop here. I'm not even getting into the younger generation. My apologies. I have another...